All right. Yeah, welcome to our online meeting for Soil CRC Community of Practice for the South. Thanks very much for coming along. And I'd like to welcome Susan Ogle from New South Wales DPI, who's here today to give us a rundown on soil carbon, which was a priority issue for you guys when we got together and worked out what this soil community of practice priorities were and what we wanted to focus on and learn about going forward. So Susan's going to give us a rundown. I'd like to make this as interactive as possible. Susan will have a presentation, but please use the chat so that you can make some comments or ask some questions along the way and chat to each other and that sort of thing. Don't forget to take some notes with your Soil CRC pens. And when we get to the end, you know, if you want to, because we'll have some things in the chat, feel free to sort of stay at the end and take some notes out of that, although I will download everything and share it to you. But also I'll just hang on at the end of the meeting so that if you wanted to have a chat about anything or anything particular that Susan has spoken about or anything to do with the community of practice, just I'll hang around towards at the end of the meeting so we can do that. And just to give you an update on what's happening with the Extension Oz that the group that Soil CRC would like to proceed with. We're getting the agreement with the Extension Oz sorted out, and I sent you an email about the organisations having to sign up or be a part of the agreement. So if you have any concerns about that, please let me know. But it's really just about some intellectual property protection and an agreement for the organisations to cooperate. So, but like I said, if you have any issues or concerns about that, please let me know as soon as you can. That would be good. Yes, and if you have any other feedback about the community of practice, I'm always open to it. So, yeah. Without any further ado, what I might actually get you guys to do is, for Susan's benefit, she has had a look at the community of practice plan, but I might ask you, we might just whip around and just mention some of the specific soil carbon issues or projects that you might be working on, and that'll just give Susan a bit of a background as well. So, Helen, would you mind going first?
Thanks, Felicity. Hi, Suze. We know one another through other different types of projects. I guess my concerns around carbon in the Central Western districts are how growers can build their soil carbon. We're mixed farming enterprises out here and low rainfall zones. So whether there are easy strategies for the guys out here to build carbon. One project that we are pretty heavily involved in around soil carbon is the Mars Pet Care project, with which we are involved with Riv Plains. And that's been able to, it's been a fantastic project because we've been able to do a lot of soil sampling and get a really good handle on what the actual soil carbon levels are in our district. Because the same as Cassie Schaaf, had the opinion of, well, soil carbon is about 1 out here, and we're finding ranges from below 1 to looking up close to 2% soil carbon. So that project's, I'm really looking forward to how that develops and us being able to unpack a little bit more around, I guess, what farmers are doing and farming practices are doing to be able to get these differences in carbon. But I'm always happy to hear other knowledge and hear more about what Suze has to say in the soil carbon world.
Fantastic. Thanks, Helen. Aisha?
Hi, thanks, Felicity. I'd say we're in a similar boat to Helen. We're a lot of mixed agriculture around here, and some of the farmers in my land care group are really interested in getting more involved in regenerative agriculture and switching over some of their farming practices. So the group has been talking about doing some sort of education programs, getting some speakers down here in the next 12 months to talk about regenerative agriculture, or alternative ways to manage soil in the area.
Great. Thanks, Sasha. Kate?
Thanks, Felicity, and thanks for joining us today, Susan. So projects or things that I'm particularly interested in relating to soil carbon. Leading off the region ag thing is we've been getting a lot of questions from growers about, is this too good to be true? When they're talking about increases in soil carbon. I'm running 2 projects through the Wimmera CMA and the Mallee CMA, both of which involve creating a baseline data set of soil carbon in the region and then retesting every 5 years. Continually testing for 5 years. And I've got a trial going with James Hunt and Harm Van Rees looking at if we can increase, if there's a way to increase soil carbon by increasing nitrogen rates of applications. That would be a particular interest of mine, is the nutritional aspects of soil carbon. If we're depleting it, increasing it or keeping it the same. And if there's any good data somewhere that conclusively proves management practices influence soil carbon in the medium and low rainfall zones, because while it makes sense that it would, I haven't been able to find any studies that conclusively show it, especially in cropping.
Thanks, Kate. Jane?
Yep. Hi, everyone.
Oh.
Is it James, sir?
You go, James.
You go, James.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's
Sorry. Yeah, I'll just be quick. So we haven't actually got any soil carbon projects on the go right now, but yeah, so it's broadacre cropping dryland area at Temora. So it's always in people's mind, I guess. They're trying to maintain or increase carbon in that system, which is obviously hard. Yeah, so soil carbon is going backwards in a lot of the continuous cropping systems. And yeah, I guess it's something that our farm members are very interested in, how to increase it and how to do it economically. Yep.
Thanks, James. Jane?
Yeah, so as Helen said, we're heavily involved in the Mars project, like they are. So it is really interesting getting a feel for the region of values. And with that, this year, we did a little bit of investigation with rainfall, and it'll be really interesting to see this year, with areas having a bit more rainfall, the effect that rainfall has on carbon. And just looking at the fluctuation, I suppose, of carbon. A lot of people think it's just a number that will be the same or different, but is there a natural fluctuation? And yeah, so that's probably the main carbon we have, but we have a lot of continuous farmers who are doing some pretty out there things to try and increase it while remaining profitable. And I think that's the biggest things. They need to get a yield. So, you know, that's their biggest aim. So how do they do that without depleting their carbon?
Yep, excellent. Thanks, Jane. Emma?
Hi, Suze. I think we've had a bit of communication by email, but we haven't probably met in person. So lovely to see you. In terms of carbon, in the region, or in South Australia, Primary Industries, through Amanda Shapel, conducted a survey that looked at historical data on carbon, and that's due to be released end of month. So that'll be really interesting to perhaps form up a baseline. AGX has got a grant to run a forum that focuses on climate and carbon next year. It was postponed from this year, and subsequent to that, some workshops that growers will lead in terms of topics relating to carbon that they want to address through speakers or training and extension. And yeah, on the back of the other comments on regen, there's a group here also, and they talk about functional carbon and how they might be looking at what could be sequestered, but also how they, you know, how it's cycled, and how they're looking at using plants to unlock nutrition and, looking at their nutrition program slightly differently. But carbon always comes up as kind of one of those topics that, is a goal, but they're not sure how they might address it necessarily. And we've also got an opportunity to reframe an NLP project, and there's potential for carbon to slot into that area too. So yeah, just keen to see what we could work up for those projects.
Great, thanks Emma. Phoebe.
Thanks, Felicity. Hi, Susan and everyone. Yeah, Holbrook Landcare has a regular soil testing program. So within this region, the soil organic carbon fluctuates from between 0 and 2. So it's relatively 2 being the highest, really. So we really are looking at measuring soil carbon over time, the options to use soil carbon or, save it in the soil. We've got a couple of projects, our Adaptive Farming Systems project, and I've also got an MLA Acid Soils discussion group. So, soil organic carbon comes up quite a bit. So yeah, definitely looking at how we can improve organic carbon accumulation and storage, looking also at nutrient cycling within the soil, and also around here specifically looking at management systems and practices that contribute to the increase in organic carbon.
Great, thanks Phoebe. Thanks everybody. It's good to get a recap on where you're all at and what you're thinking. So thanks Suze, I'll over to you.
Excellent, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Give me 2 seconds. And there's always a little bit of a delay when I load the presentation, so I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
Now, can you, hang on, it's loading. All right, so can now everyone see the presentation?
Yep, looks
Yep.
good.
Fantastic. All right, well, thanks for that. And that was great to get an overview of where people's interests lie in soil organic carbon. I think what I took away from that and what I take great joy in is people's willingness and interest in monitoring and measuring soil organic carbon. The best thing, in my opinion, about Regen Ag is just the increased focus on soil health and soil carbon as one of those metrics. And for the spectrum of views that there is on that particular, I guess, view on farming, the best thing is that people are thinking about carbon as something that's not only something we can measure, but it's also something that's driving productivity and soil health. And so I'm really pleased to hear that people are interested in that as well. A bit of background on me. So I work for New South Wales DPI. My area of research is soil organic carbon, and I've been with DPI for 15 years now. I also lead the Soil South R&D team. So in southern New South Wales, we've got 21 staff in my team who look at a range of soil constraints and nutrient management as well. But today I'm here to talk about my research, which is on soil organic carbon. And to begin with, we've got a range of expertise across, I guess, our audience today. So what I want to talk about is the flows of soil carbon around the landscape. And the reason I like to start with this slide is because it brings everyone up to the same level of understanding. And for all of the questions that people have about soil carbon, I think if you understand this slide and how carbon flows around the landscape and how farm management can influence it, you can almost start to answer some of your own questions. So let's begin the journey. So obviously soil organic carbon comes from plant biomass and from microbial biomass as well. But the way carbon gets into the soil is through the process of photosynthesis. So where plants combine carbon dioxide and sunlight and water and make energy and oxygen. And this is where I guess the big grab for farmers is, because it's all about more solar panels. So the more photosynthesis people can have on their properties, then the more I guess they can influence soil organic carbon accumulation. And so it aligns directly with productivity in the very first instance. So if you can grow more biomass, you can potentially sequester more carbon. And if you were just going to think about it in this snapshot, you could think, right, well, how do I grow more biomass? Do I have a soil constraint that might be acidicity or acidity? Is it a nutrient constraint? Perhaps it's a physical constraint like compaction, and overcoming that might be able to supply more organic matter to the soil and grow more biomass. So once the carbon dioxide gets converted into, I guess, liquid carbon or solid carbon in the plant, it can be stored above ground or below ground. Approximately 40% of all carbon dioxide that's sequestered into the plant stays above ground, and about 60% goes below ground. Now, about half of what goes below ground gets leaked out through the roots in the form of root exudates. And that's that really important carbon-rich, I guess, carbohydrate or energy material that the plant roots leak out to make sure that they have soil organisms come and live within the rhizosphere. So that zone within the plant root system, that's about 1 millimetre around the roots, and which is like a hive of activity for our microscopic livestock in our soil. So it's really important, root exudates. That carbon turns over really, really rapidly. So while our roots are leaking out this carbon-rich material, it also drives that microbial productivity and can be respired quite quickly. We've also got carbon in above ground biomass. So we have it in standing shoots and stems, in leaves and litter, and then in manure when we have grazing livestock as well. Below ground, we've also got that root biomass carbon. Once carbon or organic matter is in the soil, we refer to it as soil organic matter. So once it's mixed with the mineral soil, and that's what we'd refer to as that soil organic matter pool. Now, soil organic matter can be occluded within aggregates, so crumbs of soil, and when it's wrapped up nice and tightly within an aggregate, we refer to that as aggregate protected organic matter. So as a scientist, when we collect a soil sample and we either send it to the lab or I take it back to my lab and we dry the sample, then we crush it up and then we sieve it, and we can measure that type of carbon. And we might measure it and say, well, that was a pretty labile type of carbon. It was really high nitrogen. It would have been decomposed quite readily by organisms. So therefore it maybe would have only been in the soil for maybe, you know, weeks to months. If we actually think about where that soil organic matter has come from, as I said, it was wrapped up nice and tightly within a soil aggregate. That actually means that it was protected from decomposition. So while we might measure it in the lab as being quite labile, management which enhances soil structure and aggregation can actually enhance the residence time, or how long organic matter is going to stay in the soil. And that's a really important role that management can have. Now, some of our studies have shown that organic matter that would have been measured as labile back in the lab, in the field, lasted between 40 and 60 years. So wrapped up nice and tight. So the importance of soil structure is highlighted there. We also have within that soil organic matter pool our microbes. So organic matter also refers to the microbial biomass in the soil, and this is what I refer to as our microscopic livestock, but it also includes our other soil organisms, so protozoa, nematodes, earthworms, which all use that organic matter for energy. Now, most of our nutrients pass through that microbial pool to become available to the plants. So soil organic matter is a really important nutrient reservoir for our plants as well. Now, when microbes start to decompose organic matter, they'll respire some carbon dioxide off, but the carbon that gets occluded within their bodies or secreted from them can be quite a stable form of carbon. And that's what builds humus in our soil, so that dark staining that we can get in soils as well. Now, that microbial pool can also, so that can be quite a stable form of carbon in the soil, and those microbial products can also form really nice tight bonds with clays in the soil, which can make the carbon in the soil quite chemically protected. So it can have a longer residence time in the soil, so it can build up more readily. So we've got these different ways of protecting carbon in the soil. So we've got our above ground management, which can increase the organic matter supply. Then we've got some soil processes which can influence organic matter accumulation. Now you might be familiar with some soil organic carbon tests which look at the type of carbon. So I've mentioned a couple of types already. I've referred to particulate organic matter or labile carbon. So that's the energy source for a lot of our organisms. So that's the readily decomposable fraction. We've got the humic pool, so the humus in the soil, and that's basically dead microbes and microbial products which build up in the soil, and that's a really important source of nutrients as well. And then in our Australian soils in particular, we can have quite a range of char content as well, and some of our soils have been shown to have up to 35% char. So this isn't from stubble burning, for example. This is more from patterns of burning across tens of thousands of years across the Australian landscape. We also have carbon leaving this system. So we have plants respiring carbon dioxide, and we also have soil organisms which respire carbon dioxide as well as they start to decompose that organic matter. Another pathway of loss or the leakiness in this system can be through soil erosion. So this doesn't necessarily mean that the carbon goes back up into the atmosphere, but it certainly could if it gets decomposed, but it means that it's a loss from the site. And this is where when we look at preventing soil erosion is a really important way of retaining carbon in our soils. Now this flow of landscape isn't just for this particular system that we're looking at here, which is a cropping system. The flow happens across all farming landscapes and across landscapes just in general. I guess what changes is the rate and the extent of that flow. So the same process is happening in a perennial pasture, for example, in this picture here, and also happens in a landscape which is in the rangelands. So that flow is just the same. And it's all thinking about, I guess, how do you influence how much organic matter goes into the soil, how long it can stay there, and reducing the loss to some extent. But remember I said the nutrients need to pass through that microbial pool as well. So accumulating carbon isn't just about taking carbon from the atmosphere, keeping it in the soil. It needs to be functional. And I think someone mentioned that before, because that carbon is the energy source for that nutrient turnover and the nutrient supply, I guess, which is driving that microorganism process as well. Now I've used a couple of terms interchangeably. So I've spoken about soil organic matter and soil organic carbon. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the difference between these two things. So when we refer to soil organic matter, for a soil scientist and for most soils tests when you get them back, it's referring to organic matter in the less than 2 millimeter fraction of soil. So this is just the process that we use to standardize those soil samples so that we're talking about not the big long roots in the soil, but that less than 2 millimeter fraction. The less than 2 millimeter fraction is more closely related to the functions which influence soil properties. So that's why it's important. And if you include the greater than 2 millimeter fraction, you can get quite a range of quite variable results. When we're looking at in practice, though, the greater than 2 millimeter fraction of organic matter is really important for wrapping up and stabilizing soil aggregates and for creating channels through the soil as well. So it's not to say that it's not important, but this is how we standardize that. Now, the less than 2 millimeter fraction of soil organic matter includes microbes, humus, and charcoal, and the partially decomposed organic residues, so small bits of plant matter and manure as well. Now, carbon is what we measure in the soil organic matter, so it's the measurable fraction. And soil organic matter is approximately 58% carbon by weight. Okay, so it's mostly carbon, but it's made up of a whole heap of other things as well. So the rest are nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and a range of micro and trace nutrients as well. Now, the next thing I just want to touch on is some different units that we use when we're talking about soil organic carbon. So soil organic carbon is the total organic carbon in the soil. So when you send your soil sample off to a lab and you get the results back, if you're using a dry combustion method, it's talking about the total amount of organic carbon in that soil. And It can be in percentage, or it might be in the grams of carbon per 100 grams of soil. So that's usually what we look at. We try not to look at the soil organic matter percent, because that's a calculation where they've taken the carbon measurement and multiplied it to get a soil organic matter content. So we try to just look at carbon. We also these days focus quite a bit on soil organic carbon stocks, and these are reported in tonnes of carbon per hectare. And generally, we report these to 30 centimetres. And the reason for that is just the international focus on carbon sequestration in soils and carbon trading. So it's a really important association to make. Now, when we're talking about soil organic carbon stocks, this is the calculation. So it takes the total organic carbon in soil, so the measurement that I've just previously spoken about. It uses the bulk density of the soil and the depth over which that soil sample was collected from. So it's the concentration by the density of the soil by the depth, so that you can come up with a weight of carbon per hectare for a given mass. One more unit that I just want to touch on is carbon dioxide equivalents, because this can often be reported as well. There was quite an important miscommunication case just recently about some extraordinary rates of sequestration which were reported, where it was a miscommunication, and it was a twofold miss. So first of all, not only did they use soil organic matter instead of soil organic carbon in their calculation, so already you've made it bigger than it actually is, but then they also reported it in carbon dioxide equivalents, but when it got typed up and reported in the press, it was actually they reported in tonnes of carbon per hectare, but it was actually carbon dioxide equivalents. So it's really important to think about what unit you're talking about. So for carbon dioxide equivalents, 1 tonne of soil carbon is equal to 3.66 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide equivalents are basically a metric unit that we use to compare the emissions of greenhouse gases based on their global warming potential. So it's what we use in reporting, but it's going to be really careful when you're, I guess, reading about claimed sequestration rates. Okay, so why are we interested in soil carbon? I've already said that it's really important for nutrient cycling. It's essential for water infiltration, and it's a driver of crop and pasture productivity. So there are these immense production benefits from increasing soil organic carbon. So let's think about some specific examples. So we know that by increasing soil organic carbon, you can get an increase in the cation exchange capacity of soils as well. So our cation exchange capacity is the soil's ability to hold on to and exchange nutrients. And in particular, it looks at I call it our EM, so calcium, potassium, sodium, aluminium, and magnesium. Now, depending on the soil type, soil organic carbon can actually account for up to 90% of the cation exchange capacity. So that would be more looking at our really sandy soils. So in most soils, our cation exchange capacity is determined by the clay content and the type of clay and soil organic carbon. So when we're thinking about the production benefits of increasing soil organic carbon, if we imagine a room, and it's a room full of people sitting on chairs. Now that room is our soil, okay? The chairs are our exchange surfaces on the clay. Okay, let's just think about clay, okay? So however many chairs we've got in the room, that's how many cations, the EMs, that we can hold on to. So all the people sitting on chairs are the cations. Okay, so now imagine that what we can do in that room is that we can bring in a whole heap more chairs. So we can hold on to a whole heap more nutrients, and that's by increasing soil organic carbon. It brings more chairs into the room. Now what we're looking at is we've got a whole heap of people sitting on chairs, everyone's happy, right? Now imagine if we halved the amount of chairs in the room. So now half the people are standing. We've reduced the amount of organic carbon in the soil, okay? So we've reduced the soil's ability to hold on to those nutrients. Now what's going to happen? All of those nutrients are in solution and the soil's not actually holding on to them anymore. So soil organic carbon is a really important way of enhancing, I guess, the fertility and the production capacity of some of our soils. And it's even more important, I guess, in our sandier soils and in our clay-rich soils, but still important in clay soils as well. Now, soil organic matter is a really important nutrient reservoir. So in a loamy soil, a 1% increase in soil organic carbon, so going from 1 to 2% soil organic carbon, can give you over a ton of nitrogen, over 200 kilos of phosphorus and about 170 kilos of sulfur. And that's just in that organic matter pool. So it's a really important source of nutrients. The majority of nutrients that farmers apply to their soils need to first pass through a soil organism before they become plant available. So that organic matter pool is really, really important, because remember, organic matter is the energy and it's also the microbes. Increasing soil organic carbon is also really important for increasing water holding capacity. So increasing water infiltration and the soil's ability to be a sponge and hold on to water. Now, 1% increase in soil organic carbon, again, can be an extraordinary increase in the amount of water that a soil can actually hold. So that when we're thinking about rainfall, and people might say they've got 50 mil of rainfall and it was a great shower, how much of that actually entered into the soil? Because that's what the plants actually need, and that's what we need for our farming system. So that's really important. Now, soil organisms also use organic matter for their energy, and they secrete sticky substances which stick particles together. Fungal hyphae can wrap up soil aggregates, which make the soil stable, and this enhances the water holding capacity as well. Now, what I want you to think about with these three important points is that the microbes are using the carbon. Okay, so it's not just about accumulating carbon, but it's about that role of carbon, or the functional carbon, in the soil as well. Now, another reason, I guess, that we're interested in soil organic carbon is the off-farm benefits. So clean air, clean water, the climate mitigation. And this is why there's an increasing community interest in increasing soil organic carbon on farms as well. Now, we can trade soil organic carbon, both on the national market through the voluntary scheme and through the Australian government scheme. There's lots of pledges for carbon neutrality at the industry level, as well as at smaller levels as well. And there's emerging green markets where farmers can be paid for increases in soil condition, and one of those improvements can be soil organic carbon. Now, when we're thinking about this, it's also important to remember that soils will vary in their capacity to sequester and protect carbon. So when we're thinking about the amount of soil organic carbon that we're getting back on our soil test result, that's determined by a couple of things: the amount of carbon supply, or organic matter supply, so how much organic matter is going into the soil. That can be the biomass grown on site or grown off site and brought onto the site, so hay and silage. Perhaps it's an amendment that's added to the site, so carbon in compost and biosolids that's brought into the site. And it's also balanced by the carbon loss, like I've spoken about before, so the respiration and loss with decomposition and erosion. Now, that balance is going to be modified by a couple of things. It's going to be modified by the type of organic matter, in particular the carbon to nitrogen ratio, and also the soil's capacity to store carbon. So the clay percentage, the type of clay that's there, the depth at which soil carbon is accumulating, and soil structure, because remember, those aggregates can protect organic matter as well. So some of these factors also drive productivity. Some of these factors can be influenced by management, so we can change or influence the type of plants that are grown. We can influence soil structure, and some can't be changed easily. So it's hard to change the clay content of soil, although I guess there's clay delving and there are ways to do that. And in terms of soil depth, then that's another thing that's kind of challenging to change in the short term. So we've got these soil and vegetation and climate factors that are influencing carbon sequestration. And at the regional level, these can be extraordinarily large. So in one of our studies down on the Monero, we're looking at permanent perennial pastures. And in the same region, on different soil types, so basalt-derived soils compared with granite-derived soils, there was twice as much carbon in the basalt-derived soil. So it's under the same climate, obviously, so same rainfall patterns, same hours of sunlight, same pasture composition, but the soil type was different. And on our basalt soils, which are high in clay and highly fertile, they were able to store twice as much carbon with the granite-derived soils, which were quite sandy and a duplex profile. So soil type's really important to think about when you're considering the carbon sequestration potential and that potential change of land management. I was really pleased to hear someone say that they just wanted some figures and some references that they wanted to quote, because the next 2 slides are full of references and my extension colleagues tell me they're a bloody nightmare to present, but I just can't help myself, because the amount of times I've been sitting in presentations and people say increasing soil organic, it's like it's too hard, you can't do it, it's this, it's that, and we have so much data which shows that you can increase soil organic carbon. Okay, it's going to be determined by climate factors, vegetation factors, soil factors, but let's look at the hard numbers, right? So I'm going to show you this table, and the reason I hide it to begin with is because I want to give you that introduction that it's the extension person's worst nightmare. And we're going to look at a range of management factors. Then it's going to be a column with the carbon sequestration rate. So this is the tons of carbon per hectare per year that is sequestered, so stored in the soil in addition to what was already there, to 30 centimetres. The years over which that trial was run, and the reference. So the reason the years over which that trial is run is important is that generally when you change land use or management practice, you'll get a rapid increase in soil organic carbon. So most of the change will happen in the first 5 to 10 years, and then it plateaus off. So that if we're looking at a 5-year study, we might have higher sequestration rates than we do when we're looking at sequestration rates over a 20-year study, because it's gone up really quickly and then it starts to plateau off. So just think about that when we look at some of these numbers. So I want to start with pastures, and we're going to look at, this is very New South Wales centric, so I'm sorry about that, looking at those levers that we can pull to increase production. So things like liming, looking at pasture rotations. So this is looking at, sorry, it should say perennial pastures, but perennial pastures in rotation, nutrient management, so making sure that pastures have adequate nutrition, grazing management, and also looking at irrigation as well. So let's look at some of these rates. So what we're looking at here are rates which range from 0.1 tonne per hectare per year up to 1.5 tonnes per hectare per year. Okay, so this is looking at sequestration rates across a range of soil types and systems. They were replicated studies and it's published literature, and these are the rates. Now, some of these rates are higher than the government modelled rates, and so they're achieving more than that. Some of these rates are in the extremely low rainfall zone. So the grazing management, where we've looked at strategic and rotational grazing, so time controlled grazing, they were, and that was up to 1.5 tonnes per hectare. That was in the low rainfall zone. Okay, so there's some of these figures are quite impressive. And I guess there's a couple of things to think about. If you're starting from a lower soil organic carbon content, you may expect a more significant increase with practice or land use change. It also depends on the, I guess, magnitude of that change as well. So there's some, and you can have access to these. So you'll have the papers, and I'm happy to share any of these papers with you as well. But if we look at what's consistent here is if you're overcoming a constraint, or if you're supplying nutrients to the plant or grazing a plant so that it can grow more and photosynthesize more, then you can increase carbon and sequester carbon. Now, if we look at some of our cropping examples, we're looking at conversion of cultivated crop to pasture and the use of fertilizer or organic amendments in that change, as well as pasture rotations within cropping systems. So particularly important for the mixed farming zone. So our sequestration rates here actually can range up to a bit higher, but I want to draw your attention to the ones where we've got a conversion of cultivated crop to pasture and fertilizer and organic amendments. Now, these were 5-year studies, so I'd anticipate that they would plateau off. So that means that when we come back and resample these and look at sequestration rates over 10 years, it might come back down to that more expected rate of maybe 0.5 tonne of carbon per hectare per year. So we can see here again that there are some options, management practices which will increase soil organic carbon. a lot of these practices involve nutrition, and a lot of these practices in cropping systems rely on the importance of the pasture phase. So that pasture phase is so important for building soil organic structure and supplying organic matter. And we've known this for a really long time. But then in a minute, I'm going to talk about why that might bounce around a bit as well. So these are some of the sequestration rates that we've got in the literature. But then we've got lots of examples where soil organic carbon doesn't increase despite best management. And we've got to think about the reasons for this. And this can be really disheartening for a lot of producers, and a lot of producers that I've worked with have just thought that perhaps they're doing everything right and they're producing well and they're doing this, this and this, and they're not seeing that increase in soil organic carbon. There's some really good reasons. Now, in those really productive, healthy soils, often what it comes down to is that you've got such a high turnover of organic matter because the soils are functioning so well with that microbial activity. That increase is really, really incremental because there's a greater supply of organic matter going into the soil now, but the bugs are fired up. So they're supplying nutrients. They're doing what we want them to do. So they're using that carbon as functional carbon, but the increase can be quite small. Now, the photos that are on the screen now, on the left-hand side, that was a continuously grazed site, which I was monitoring. On the right-hand side was the other side of the fence, which was a cell grazed site. So already, if you're just eyeballing that, you'd be like, oh God, of course, the right-hand side's going to have more carbon, left-hand side's going to have less, and that's just going to be the end of it. And that was not the case in this study. And so we looked at this site over 8 years. And what we found was exactly what I just alluded to. We had a higher amount of soil organism activity on the right-hand side, on the cell grazed side, compared to the continuously grazed side, but we actually didn't see a difference in soil organic carbon when we looked at total pools. Now, there can be some other reasons. As I said before, soil type can be one of the reasons perhaps we're not seeing a difference. It might be climate, because we have these major drivers of productivity and decomposition as soil type and climate. It could come down to poor crop and pasture nutrition. So perhaps the management comparison isn't sensitive enough. So a classic example of that is where we did a survey looking to try and identify whether or not rotationally grazed and continuously grazed pastures had a difference in soil organic carbon stocks. Now, one of the confounding factors in the survey study that we undertook was that all our rotationally grazed pastures were also no or low input pastures as well. So they just had really poor soil nutrition and plant nutrition. So there was no difference in grazing management, but I reckon it was probably more due to that soil nutrition constraint rather than the impact of grazing management. So there's often, and that's the, I guess, exciting, but also complex and complicated thing about when we're comparing systems. Hey, and that's, I guess, a challenge for regenerative ag thinking as well. Sometimes the systems might be water limited, i.e. drought, so maybe we don't see a response. If you've got producers which have already been undertaking a practice for a large amount of time, perhaps you've already got large background levels of soil organic carbon, and this is often what we find in perennial pastures. And the way I describe this to producers is, say that you've got 2 buckets, right? Now you get one and they're both empty, and then you get one bucket and you fill it up with sand, okay? And now you look at those 2 buckets and you go, yep, one's full of sand, the other isn't. And then you get a cup of sand, okay? So it's 1 cup of sand. You pour that into the bucket which is already full of sand, you probably wouldn't even see it, would you? You wouldn't even notice it. If you poured that cup of sand, so it's exactly the same amount, into the empty bucket, you'd see it. Okay, so the amount of carbon wasn't different, but the detectability, because of that starting level or the background carbon, was means that it maybe or maybe isn't statistically detectable. The other thing is, the most beautiful thing about soils is the spatial variability, and sometimes that can be a real challenge in detecting changes. And then in some cases, breaks my heart, but maybe soil organic carbon isn't the best metric. We need to think about multiple metrics. And in that photo comparison on this slide, we demonstrated an increase in water infiltration, an increase in microbial function and respiration, an increase in perenniality and cover. They're all really important things. We didn't demonstrate an increase in soil carbon, but so what? That's taken me a long time and a lot of therapy to say that so what part. So I hope you all appreciated that. Whew, okay. Very quickly, I just want to touch on some work we've done on pasture phases, because as I said before, in the mixed farming zone and cropping systems, often it comes down to the utilization of that pasture phase if you really want to increase your soil organic carbon. So retaining stubble might reduce the loss of carbon. It's a really slow way to build carbon. Really important for surface soil protection, for infiltration, and for a whole range of other things. But in terms of soil carbon, retaining stubble isn't always a way to rapidly build up soil organic carbon. But pasture phases definitely, I guess, offers that that opportunity. But what we often see with where we've got a pasture phase and a cropping phase is that during the pasture phase, you'll get a build up of soil organic matter. So you're building up your soil organic, so your carbon and your nitrogen. And then when you get to the cropping phase, if you don't apply nitrogen, and does that, I don't mean if you, doesn't matter if you're squeezing it out of a chook or pouring it out of a bag, if you don't apply nitrogen for that crop, you start to use that organic matter supplied nitrogen, and you get a rundown in organic matter and carbon, so carbon and nitrogen. Now, back in the days where we first looked at pasture phases, their role was for increasing soil structure and for supplying biological nitrogen, right? For building up nitrogen. So there's this agronomic value in the organic matter that you build up during the pasture phase, and then you use it during the cropping phase, and then you build it up again. Now, if we want to build carbon in that system, we need to add nitrogen for that crop. And that's what a lot of our trials have shown, that if you've got a continuously cropped system and you're applying lots of nitrogen, then you can have similar levels as if you have this bouncing around carbon system where you're building it up during the pasture phase, running it down during the cropping phase to really build carbon and to lift that bottom line that we can see on this figure now. You need to add additional nitrogen to the system, or tweak the length of your pasture phase and your cropping phase. So two things that you could do. So there is no dispute that you've got these sacred benefits of pasture rotation. So for structure, for nitrogen, for enhancing the retention of nutrients, as well as for sequestering carbon. But good crops, as I said, need nitrogen, and this is going to come from that soil nitrogen pool, but often from fertilizer as well. So we have this inevitable consequence that you'll kind of mineralize nitrogen that's in that organic matter pool unless you're adding more, or unless you're kind of tweaking the length of those phases. Now, I guess adding to this dilemma is that in the surface soil, our soil carbon to nitrogen ratios kind of are quite tight. So they're between 10:1 and 14:1. So that means 10 units of carbon to 1 unit of nitrogen, maybe up to about 14:1. So in this system, to provide nitrogen to the crop, it will come at that loss of soil organic carbon. So you can't have you can't sequester carbon and have cheap nitrogen as well. So just as an example, so I've said about that 10:1 to 14:1, wheat stubble is about 80:1, and I think mature lucen's about 25:1. So still you'll have that loss of carbon to build up, if you want to use nitrogen in those systems. So I've covered that. We've got this build up. So to avoid a net rundown in soil organic matter and carbon over time, as I said, you tweak the length of the pasture phase. You can look at the type of pasture that you have in there. So you definitely want to have a legume in there, but we've also looked at a range of the type of legume and the mix of legume and grasses, if you can do that, if you want to utilize it for livestock grazing as well. And you want to build up enough soil organic matter so you can do both, have some cheap nitrogen, but also build up soil organic carbon. So this is my second last slide, and I just wanted to run through some of the strategies that we know to build up soil organic carbon. Now, I wanted to also highlight that in isolation, some of these might only reduce the loss of carbon, so you might just stay at the same level or you might not decline. You might need to use multiple of these strategies. So changing the crop and pasture sequence. So the pasture phase is king, and thinking about how that can enhance soil health. But there's an agronomic value to that too, as well, as I said, the kind of value of the nitrogen that soil organic matter build up. introducing cover crops. And I had in here multi-species plantings as well. I guess with any of these, you need to think about the trade-off with production of the following crop. So in some cases, you just don't have the soil moisture to have a cover crop there. So you need to think about, right, what do I actually need to achieve in this system? Am I willing to have a bit of a yield penalty so that I have more cover and carbon, or is that soil water too precious to me? So managing your nutrient inputs to optimize plant growth, so it's just good agronomy, but also microbes need nutrients too. And a lot of Clive Kirkby's work looked at, I guess, you kind of fertilize your crops and you fertilize your microbes as well. I'm not necessarily promoting that, but I definitely am promoting the fact that you need to think about the nutrient requirements and balance between growing a big healthy crop or pasture, but also the fact that your microbes need nutrients too. Overcoming soil constraints, so that might be through the application of lime for acidic soils or gypsum for sedicity compaction or surface sealing. A lot of the sites that I've been looking at lately, it's really a physical constraint to production that we're seeing. So we're kind of getting the soil test results back and nutrients are bang on. Carbon levels seem pretty reasonable, but there's no space for air or water in that soil, so it's really hard for a plant to grow. And it's a shame that we kind of can't report that on a soil test, because it would make it easier if actually kind of get out and get the shovel out and have a look at that. In some cases, thinking minimizing tillage is good for water retention, and it's good for protecting the surface soil and enhancing or protecting soil structure. But we've got work out now that shows that strategic tillage to overcome a soil constraint or to overcome a plant constraint, so a pathogen, can be done without compromising your soil organic carbon levels. And I think that's a challenging message for some no-tillers, but also it's a worthwhile message thinking about, because strategic tillage, so not belting the crap out of the soil, but doing it when you have to and doing it carefully, can actually increase production and therefore increase carbon sequestration through that rule of grow more biomass, store more carbon.
Suze, sorry, can I just interrupt, just because it was that point that you're on. We just had a question from Kate from BCG saying, in regards to that minimum till aspect, wondering if there's any data on non-cultivated cropping systems, as most of the Mallee hasn't been cultivated for 20 years now. So they are in a controlled traffic no-till system. So I guess we're just wondering about, carbon sequestration or increasing soil organic carbon in those systems.
So, sorry, was that in relation to would strategic tillage increase carbon in those systems, or was it just in relation to what management strategy would?
It was just when you had all the sequestration, increasing sequestration rates, and they're all going from a cultivated cropping to pasture or to uncultivated cropping, and it's sort of like, well, a lot of the farmers I'm working with, it's like, well, where's the next step? Like, we're already not cultivating, we're already retaining our stubbles in the years that we get enough rainfall to grow them, and that's why we're running a trial looking at increasing nutrition. But it's
well, you bang on there. So it's
cropping, and it's just hard work to find some data that shows the most profitable way, or a profitable way, to increase soil carbon.
Yeah, I think the only levers you've got to pull there are looking at, if you can, cover crop or pasture phase, but really you're already doing it through nutrition. And then the other thing certainly is, and I don't touch on it that much, but perhaps I should more so, is looking at the application of organic amendments. The reason I guess I don't is because there's so much other low-hanging fruit in the general farming community in terms of some of those production constraints, but certainly there's some exciting new information coming out around biological inoculants and composts. I worry about that. I still wonder how applicable they are to broadacre big areas. Like, I think you're just going to hit the back pocket constraint before you kind of get anywhere. But Yeah, so I think you're kind of already thinking about it in the right way in terms of nutrient management, but also thinking about what you grow when. You could think about building up or changing your microbial community through through your rotation choice, like your crop rotation choice. So that could be another way as well. There's some exciting data coming out of the States looking at, I guess, diverse plantings for carbon accumulation through different types of roots and different root architectures. But I think, or different root morphologies, I think often what people get scared of there is that, like, it's kind of we're chasing a yield and a soil health benefit. You still got to make it profitable. So there can be some issues there, but sounds like you're already thinking about the right things with nutrition.
Yeah, don't know, I'll ask you about it later.
Cool. Yeah, okay. And I actually didn't include the strategic tillage paper in this presentation, but I'm happy to. But I'm not saying if people have been no-till for 20 years and that's what they're committed to, then there's thinking about what are your other options. And then this is where I think this is where a lot of our work is focused at the moment in the low rainfall zone and the rangelands, is identifying degraded soils and changing practice or land management, or identifying and targeting responsive zones. And that's where we're looking at in these big landscapes where it would just cost a bloody fortune to apply some of these new products. Just looking at going, let's not do it everywhere, let's do it where we're going to get the biggest impact, and if that's what we're doing. And carbon trading does kind of offset some of those costs as well, although it's kind of not really been, like, people aren't really rushing to take that up for carbon trading, but certainly for soil health they are. Adding carbon rich materials, so things like compost, biosolids and manures as amendments. And that was it for my list. But all right, so I just wanted to summarize by saying carbon cycling on farms already. And so that's like a really important thing to think about. And just that first slide where I was talking about kind of what can you influence and what's your low hanging fruit. So it's really about thinking to sequester more carbon, you might need to change practice, or you might just need to identify what's your biggest limitation to production. So what's your biggest lever to pull? There are going to be some soil and climate factors that limit carbon sequestration, and that's just the things we can't change. And yep, it's good to know about those, but then you think about, right, what can you actually change and what's in your toolbox to use. Now, I like to highlight this point as well, like the benefits of soil organic matter are from nutrient cycling, not just from this continual accumulation of carbon. So for a long time, I think a lot of us got hung up, I'm talking about myself now, not you guys, on like different fractions of carbon and the use of those and building stable carbon. And it's still important science and it's good to think about, but really that labile fraction of carbon is what's driving productivity and microbial health. And it's just as important as the stuff that's going to stay there for decades or hundreds of years. That's kind of your cash flow in your carbon system. And to increase soil organic carbon, so you've got to think about the right practice in the right place at the right time. So it's not about necessarily changing everything across the whole farm, but it might be thinking about, right, where could I actually identify where some of my responsive zones are and working with those ones first. That's it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks. That was brilliant. Thanks, Suze. We've got some questions in the chat, so I'll just I'll go back to sort of the beginning. Richard, before he goes, Richard just popped in the chat, with more carbon dioxide and dry climates, can more carbon be locked in the soils as soil carbonates? Oh, yeah, I guess in some, yeah, okay. So inorganic carbon accumulation through carbonates. Through that. So is there, are you talking about that's just going to happen naturally, Richard, or perhaps you're muted, Richard?
Sorry, I thought I unmuted, but I just put my video on. I didn't do both. What I'm thinking is, you know, if it's getting drier, and that's, you know, we're assuming that's happening, and there's less leaching, that you know, if a farmer enhances their biological activity, which you've been speaking of, while yes, that eats up organic carbon, I mean, it could increase the amount of CO2 and the partial pressure of CO2 in the soil. So therefore you get, in some certain soils, carbonates forming, magnesium carbonates and calcium carbonates in the lower parts of the soil, which could sequester carbon. I mean, I know it's more of a biogenic type of carbon sequestration, but it is, you know, it's seen as geological or non-organic, but really it is mitigated by that CO2 partial pressure, isn't it? So it's kind of quasi, it is biogenic. In other words, it's formed by a biological process, even though it's a mineral. Because most carbon from the atmosphere on the planet is being sequestered out of the atmosphere by basically calcite, you know, like carbonates, geologically, more geologically than soil-wise. But could soils have a role here? That's what I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna be totally honest, I've never thought about it. So thought about it like that. It's really interesting and quirky, and it kind of fits with a lot of like my rangelands work, where you do have these carbonate concretions and associations which have happened through those kind of geological scale kind of wetting and drying and fluctuations in the atmosphere. So I'll definitely give it some more thought. I can't say anything intelligent right now though.
Oh, that's okay, because certain soils, like, I mean, because I'm a geologist, of course, as well as a soil scientist, and I was reading a very, very good book over the summer break on, I forget, Symphony of Carbon, anyway. I don't know if you've seen it, and it's about the Deep Carbon Project, which is more geological than soil, but one of the ways we could potentially sequester it is by using soils and rocks which are very rich in magnesium hydroxides. These are ophiolites, we call them geologically, but we don't have a lot of this in Australia, but certain parts of the world do. And if you ground this sort of material up, because it's a magnesium calcium, or mostly magnesium hydroxide, when it weathers, it can again, with a high CO2 environment, form carbonates. And so lock up carbon.
There's a guy at ANU who has spoken about something kind of similar called Justin, I'm going to say his surname's Borovets, and I'm glad you're recording this because I'm sure it sounds nothing like that when you actually say it. And I know he's looking at rock dust or rock powders on the Monero, and that's well, he's got to kind of bid in to have a look at that for increasing soil carbon sequestration through biogeochemical processes. But it's not something I'm familiar with, but it sounds, something worthwhile giving more thought to.
That's okay. Just maybe it could be a potential research project for departments around the place. Anyway, thank you for your talk and information, which is presented awesomely. I think that's really helpful. Obviously, I teach some of the stuff myself, but that's really nice and clear. Thank you so much. And I apologise, I'll have to run along.
Cool. Okay, see you later.
Thank you.
No worries, Richard. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it was awesome. Thanks.
Good. I also had a question from Emma, or a couple of questions. Thanks, Emma. One about the input of root biomass into the pool, and towards the end you were talking about, some of that cropping, multi-species cropping and that sort of thing, trying to increase the root biomass. Do we know exactly, is there some sort of percentage input of carbon through the root biomass?
Do you know what? We have the worst figures, I think, on root to shoot ratios and root biomass because it is so hard to measure. So we kind of model it, but it's a bit scary when you look at some of the models which just use kind of, 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratios for all crops or for all pastures. So we just don't have a good understanding about the range of root biomass contributions of even of our different main crops, let alone some of the kind of new ones. So I think we kind of certainly, it's an exciting and important area, but there's not a lot of figures on it.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, it would depend on rooting depth and possibly seeding rate and
Yep.
density numbers and all those sort of things.
Yeah, and there was a really groovy paper that was put out last year. It was like in Nature Science or something from America, and it looked at not necessarily root biomass contributions, but it looked at the fact that if you, or it kind of reported the fact that if you have multi-species plantings, the different types of roots, not only their nutrient kind of makeup, carbon to nitrogen to whatever's, but also the shape and the places that they kind of can access in the soil, that's what influences carbon sequestration, not just the total amount that goes into the soil, which I thought was really interesting, but it's not it's not an area that I've worked in.
Yeah, that's okay. And I guess along the same sort of lines, the question about that intercropping for nitrogen input into the seeds during the season. And yeah, back when too many years ago to suggest, we looked at canola and field peas, for example, planting together, and that sort of come around a bit, but that's expanded to faba beans and wheat in some areas and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's I'm imagining that's those sort of opportunities could be helping to input some of that nitrogen, or help not at least take as much nitrogen out of the system in a season like that.
Definitely. And some of the work done, who some of you online definitely would know, Belinda Hackney, someone in my team, and she's doing this fantastic work looking at hard-seeded legumes, which self-regenerate. And so you get this kind of, you sow at the same time as you sow your crop, and then you get this legume kind of grow in your downtime where you kind of supply nitrogen, then it dies off and your crop, then you can resow your crop, and then it's kind of tweaking the system, and it's at that system scale where I think some of those, like, I don't know, we talk about innovation in these kind of fancy new products or this spooky science, but I still think that there's heaps of innovation to happen in the field. So
yeah, brilliant.
And we've got one of Terry Rose's trial sites here, and yeah, like that's got different cover crop species in it, and the intercropping, and like it's just a mixed bag, and there's that many tests being done there each year that I'm not sure we'll have soil left at the end of it. But yeah, that for everyone would be a really good project to follow.
Yeah, no, I'm very interested in that one as well. No, that's good.
Yeah.
And I think like what I've really learned from being in this space is that, I don't know, you have these crusty old people sitting on the sidelines that always go, you can't do it, or it's too hard, or it's this, and you have that in any field, right? You definitely do. And then you've just got these innovators that blow you away with these really interesting ideas or combinations of ideas or things. And I think that's where the big gains are to be made. And certainly my work in the rangelands is just opening my eyes to that, like just seeing how, I mean, just the interesting ideas that come from producers that know their soils and know their landscapes, and can, once they get how the system works, they'll come up with a solution to it. It's very exciting.
Yeah, I keep thinking, are we going back to the lay farming system, that we had, because we went through, we sort of had the lay farming system, and then we went into continuous cropping. And then during the millennial drought, just continuous cereals, because landholders had to pay their bills and stay in business until it started raining again, sort of thing. So now are we going back to that?
And like, I think producers now with livestock values, like the price on livestock, people need to be in you can benefit if you're in a situation where you can shift your crop to livestock ratios. And then add on top of all of this is that there's some very real opportunities for ecosystem service payments tied with carbon. So
yeah. And so Helen's, to put simply, in reply to farmers' questions of I have to put more nitrogen on every year for the same yield, is that they have run down their soil carbon and need to increase it. So yes, possibly that is.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, and I think I'm hearing that with nitrogen, and I hear it with phosphorus as well. Yep, certainly. I think it's that decline in soil organic matter. So you're not running off, I guess, that engine that you used to have. So it's just whatever you pour in to burn up. So building up soil organic matter is an important way to do that. Now, when you're pouring on lots of nitrogen as well, you're reducing those organisms which naturally supply nitrogen to the following crop as well. So it's almost like this self-perpetuating problem or this cycle that you're getting, because you've got to put more nitrogen on because you've got less of the organisms there which can access soil organic matter nitrogen or fix their own nitrogen. So you kind of get stuck in that system.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And I guess that's where that input of a legume or legume pasture to help motivate that microbiome in the soil to help cycle those nutrients.
And again, that's where that kind of diversity in roots and the diversity in organic matter inputs, which are really important. And you can kind of tweak your cropping cycle so that you get a build-up of mycorrhizal fungi for things like phosphorus and zinc and water. So there's really practical things that's not spooky that you can do to actually build up some of these microbial communities.
Yeah. Helen's made another comment. Work done in the Northern Territory rangelands grazing had minimal impact on soil carbon. Biggest difference was close to bores where stock manures were concentrated.
Yeah, and some of my work has shown no difference in grazing management as well, and that's where it's come down to identifying those responsive zones. And I mean, you can move livestock with food and with water, and we're doing a bit of work around rangeland self-herding. So not with, because a lot of it's been around fences, that the work we've done to date, but going, right, can you change grazing behaviour with water and with food without wire? And then certainly we're also looking at the role of manure and livestock movement in that kind of build up as well. So exciting stuff.
Yeah, and some of the grower groups I've been working with are talking about the use of livestock for so if you've got a multi-species or a lot of you let your biomass build up, and then they talk about grazing a third of it and then letting a third of it get trampled into to try and sort of pushing a bit of that green manure into cycle or build.
And I guess with anything, you can, like with any practice, you can do a good job at it and you can do a not good job at it. And like with that, like what some of our work is showing, you've just got to get that grazing intensity right, like have the right numbers in the right space so that they're not just eating what they want to eat, they're eating everything they have to, and that you do get that trampling happening as well. But it's kind of an exciting use of livestock as tools to change composition and carbon.
Jane, do you want to make that comment that you typed in there?
Oh, yeah, I was just saying.
No, just Jane.
Yeah, sorry. What was that?
No, Jane McGuinness, not you, James.
Oh, sorry. I'm getting my James and James mixed up. Sorry, James.
Yeah, that's all right.
Then you're talking about. I'll go back to sleep. Sorry.
Don't you dare.
We have done some pasture phase measurements this year, looking at carbon stocks so it was the end of the pasture phase this year, and so next year it'll be all cropping, just to get some numbers and go through all the pain and suffering of carbon stocks and doing it to the actual 200-page booklet that you have to for government regulations, just to go through it instead of farmers having to go through it.
Yeah. Is this for the Mars project?
Yeah. The pasture phase stuff you were talking about that's been done, where was that done?
So you're around Wagga.
Okay.
Yeah, most of our stuff's been done around Wagga. So yeah. And certainly give me a call if you want kind of some shortcuts or some spreadsheets that will help with those carbon stock changes, because over time it's not as simple as concentration, bulk density and depth. You've got to calculate for how much kind of the soil mass was at the start, and that changes. And some pain I've already gone through or do go through.
Yeah.
Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to make any comments or have any questions or anything.
Just with James here, just with continuous farming systems, if you're cropping year in, year out, and there's no cover cropping, but assuming you go and do everything else with stubble retention, which is not going to have a huge effect, is soil organic matter always going to go backwards, or can you maintain it? Are there any examples of maintaining or improving soil organic matter when cropping?
Oh, sorry, I just
Like
lost.
if you take the pasture story out of it, and we're just cropping every
Yep.
year, and if we go through the things that you said, and we
Yep.
do a best practice in a purely cropping system,
Yep.
what kind of positive result can we have? Are we still going to be going backwards with soil organic matter, or can we at least maintain it?
Not at
general?
all. I think a lot of the decline that happened a long time, like happened a while ago. So it's not kind of the last
Yep.
10 to 20 years. It happened previous to that. And we've kind of, and Brian Murphy's written a beautiful paper which kind of showed that. So we talk about continuous cropping as kind of declining our organic carbon pool, where certainly it did with those old school practices where there used to be a whole lot of tillage that happened to get a fine tilth, and we were using nutrients from that organic matter pool. But these days, with reduced or no tillage and direct drill or stubble retention and nutrient management, we're not going backwards, but perhaps we're just not increasing as fast as people would kind of hope that we are. But we've also got a whole lot of, I guess, climatic challenges as well. So certainly looking at the rotation of crops, so not looking at necessarily just looking at pasture phases, but looking at the rotation of the crops. So as I said before, you can influence those microbial communities, making sure that you're maintaining cover so that you've got less carbon loss occurring, either physical or through that decomposition at certain times of the year, and also nutrient management. You can still increase soil organic carbon with continuous. Yeah.
Susan, just a quick question again on continuous cropping systems. We've asked a bit by growers, so I'd just be curious on your thoughts in that they're growing an increasing number of pulse rotations to try and do the right thing, different microbial communities, nitrogen benefits, disease breaks, yada, yada, yada. But what's the impact of the fact that the pulses will grow less ground cover and have a higher erosion risk on soil carbon?
Yeah.
Are there any hard numbers anywhere about that, or it's all just...
Not that I can think of immediately, but I know exactly what you mean. So, and that's kind of, I mean, something you're talking about pulses, but thinking about pasture legumes, like with a pure stand of lucerne, for example, that's where I'd go looking for numbers, because that's certainly been spoken about, but I can't think of any rates of loss. But yeah, and you know, like soil loss via erosion is something that's not well documented, but it's a really big issue still.
Yeah, that's, well, and it's hard to measure, because you could grow a legume in 2016 and have no erosion, or you could grow it in 2019 and watch your paddock blow away. Like,
yeah, that's right. And with the most recent kind of drought, there was a whole lot of strategic or kind of tillage going on to stop wind erosion, which kind of worried me at the same time, because we just don't have numbers on it. But you're exactly right, that you can be at the whims of of climate as well.
And I guess that's where, you know, those opportunities of intercropping, where you can, you know, grow a bit of canola in between the rows of field peas or faba beans for a bit of stability when it dries out. But that increases your risk, because both those crops will use a lot of water.
Yeah, yep.
Areas.
So sorry for those of you who can hear my annoying 5-month-old Kelpie pup just barking at the window. He's unrelenting.
I didn't notice. Why didn't he come inside?
That's what he's wanting to do. The other day I was giving a presentation and I could hear him. I'd left him inside and he'd eaten his way into a carton of beer and drank a beer. There was like, he actually bit into a can of beer and drank a beer and just came out, and I was just like, oh my gosh. Anyway, so.
Was he happy? He must have been
Yes, very happy.
Oh dear, poor pup.
We've talked about it a little bit, like with climate and rainfall, and so at the start, you know, like we have seen even in the dry years the influence on rainfall with our carbon measurements. How big a factor is it? Like, is rainfall?
Yeah, it's enormous, and that's why people started to look at those soil organic carbon fractions, because nothing influences char other than erosion. Humus takes a long time to degrade, so that's kind of your background pool of carbon, really important background pool. But what climate influences is that particulate organic matter, so that's what builds up most rapidly, and that's what declines when you have droughts or like really poor seasons. And so people are like, all right then, well, you know, if we can account for that, then we can look at net increases in soil organic carbon. We can take into account that kind of fluctuation, because climate really just drives that particulate or labile organic carbon pool. And I guess that was the motivation behind that, but that's the most important fraction for driving those soil processes. So work on the Monero showed within 3 years, sequestration rates of up to 8 tonnes of carbon per hectare. Nothing was different other than the drought broke and they had 2 good seasons. And then 2 years later it was fine. 5 years later, they were back down to millennium drought levels.
Yeah, so if we're sampling paddocks and, you know, like farmers are at 1.2 or 1.5 and, you know, you've had 5 years of drought, really, would you say that's really good?
Yeah. And you'd kind of, and that's where you have like, and I think it was your work where you said that you're kind of doing lots of paddocks at the same time. So monitoring paddocks over time is really important, and you'll pick up that bouncing around. But when you're looking at snapshots in time and looking at what those ranges might be, if all paddocks have been under the same climatic situations, then 1.5 might be good if everyone else is at 0.9. So. And I'm assuming so with that project, are you just looking to 0 to 10 centimeters, or you, yeah.
Just for the normal farmer measurements, but then the pasture, when we did the carbon stocks, that was 0 to 30.
Yeah, okay. And that was using LECO or dry combustion. No, is anyone using Walkley and Black anymore? Because we try not to use that anymore. Just, yeah. Instatex still offers, like everyone still offers it, but for soil, if you're monitoring soil carbon, because it doesn't pick up on some active and some char components, so it can be a little bit misleading.
So what are you suggesting, Suze?
So the dry combustion method, so LECO or Jumis, yeah. So that's kind of what and that's what the Australian government uses now for all trading, but we just try and get people just to use that as well.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
A comment I'd make about rainfall is that of all the carbon cycle diagrams, doesn't include rainfall.
Yeah.
And I feel like, you know, it really needs to be in there. And I gave a talk the other day about projects that I'm delivering, and I put up a organic carbon cycle, and I said rainfall's missing, but I'm just letting you all know that it's a really important component. And if we don't get it, just saying, you know, biomass is what drives it, and if you can't grow anything from with water, you know, water drives growth too. So
no, it's a good point.
Sort of a given, I suppose.
No, but it's an important point, because I think it can be really disheartening if you don't see what you expect to see, or you don't get the outcome that you're anticipating, all because it's something that you can't necessarily control. So in climate.
Can I ask, with that work, is it that that the biomass was removed either through harvest or grazing, or are we looking at studies also that were able to retain some biomass even throughout drought, so through dry periods, so that we had cover there but no rainfall?
This is for my work, you mean?
Yeah, and maybe Jane as well. I'm not sure. In the findings.
So the Monero work that I mentioned before, we only looked at cover not continuously, but just at point of sampling. But for all our rangelands work, we look at cover through time. So we monitor them all through time. And that's what's most important, because that's what reduces that loss of carbon through wind erosion. So we might not be accumulating carbon, but if we're not reducing carbon, we're avoiding the loss of it. So cover is really important, but that's looking at more extensive systems than cropping systems.
Thanks, Suze. I noticed that we're at our 2:30 time, which we had you booked in for. So I really appreciate the time that you've been able to spend with us. Does anyone have any last burning questions to sneak in before we head off?
Just one last quick one. In some 450 to 500 mil rainfall country here, there's a researcher who's been doing some monthly N testing, and everything that he points to is that there's too much N being used in the system, and often it's overprescribed. And in alkaline soils, we're seeing a lot more acidity, and that relates also to growing huge amounts of lentils. So yeah, I was curious because it seems like we are definitely talking about what needs to be replaced in a system, but at the same time, we're seeing a lot of overprescription potentially in the environment.
Yep. Well, I can't comment on that specific example, but I think it's consistent across a lot of areas where you have this overprescription. And I don't know if it's because a lot of advisors don't have a really good understanding of that soil supply of a lot of these nutrients and the factors that regulate that supply of nutrients as well. So it is just more, if you're expecting a 3-ton crop, then you need to apply this much N and P and K without actually looking, I guess, at nutrient stocks in the soil and also the soil's ability to supply those nutrients as well, and what some of those constraints might be. Other than, yeah, that's perhaps all I have to offer. But certainly if you've got a soil test and soil organic matter is part of that kind of information that you're using to make that decision, then that can be really important, particularly for nitrogen as well.
Yeah, I think that's what we're hearing, is that it's generalized kind of prescriptions based on rates for yields as opposed to what has remained in the system from the following year, or they're really loose sort of guidelines on that, but not specific to farm or paddock.
Yep. You know, that's how I got into soil organic carbon. I used to run these workshops for DPI, and it was just all based on a recipe, right? Like, you want to grow a crop, well, you need some of this and you need some of that, and then you put in the soil and then you plant your seed, and like, it was just all recipe based, and I was like, beauty, right? And then everyone kept going, yeah, but like, what about the biology, and what about soil organic matter? Like, what about this and that? And then I kind of raced off and did a PhD. I raced off, but it took me forever to do my PhD. And I do think that and I think that's where some of these alternative ways of thinking actually are going to really challenge our soil scientists and our agricultural advisors that come from that more old school kind of agronomy background. And there's certainly still a really important role for agronomy, but we certainly shouldn't think that just by adding nutrients to the soil therefore means that plants will grow X amount with so much rainfall. There's that kind of black box of soil that we need to consider as well.
I was just talking to Belinda Hackney this morning, actually, because we've got our MLA acid soils discussion group, and looking at exactly that, like, you know, how nitrogen application is affecting the, you know, rhizobia responsive legumes, and you know, that financial impact of having ineffective legumes, the legumes that are grasses, and really what is the point if you're just applying too much nitrogen.
Yeah, and then as I said, it comes a bit self-perpetuating. Like, so use of phosphorus means that you reduce your amount of mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, and therefore you need to use more phosphorus because you're getting less. And the same with nitrogen can happen as well. And like, it's just all about the signal, like what we I think what we still need to better understand is the way that the soil environment and nutrients influence plant signals, because it's not that the superphosphate kills the mycorrhizal fungi. That's not the case. It's just that if the plants have free phosphorus from a fertilizer, and that's really easy to get, why on earth would you put your energy into producing a carbohydrate or a root exudate that's specific for a mycorrhizal fungi that you don't actually need anymore because you've already got all this phosphorus happening, so you put it into something else? And I think that we still don't really understand all of that very well. I think the thing with phosphorus, though, is that it is such a slow kind of accumulator in the soil from its rock form. So therefore, we do draw on those biological forms as well. Whereas sulfur is an easy one, turns over really rapidly, comes from the atmosphere, comes from organic matter. Nitrogen's an easy one too. Phosphorus is where I think people might hit a wall when they start to wean off fertilizers. And that's probably the first wall you'll hit.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Suze. We'll call it a day because we've gone over a little bit and I'm conscious of everyone's time and that sort of thing. So thanks so much for joining us, and thanks to everybody for being interactive and asking questions and adding your knowledge and comments as well. It's really important for everyone to learn from each other as well. So really appreciate your input. And yeah, thanks, Suze, again for making yourself available. And we'll have a look at some of those soil CRC projects that are probably going to be influencing, you know, soil carbon as well, so that we can sort of see in practice the things that Suze was talking about. So,
cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me along.
No worries at all. Thanks so much, and hopefully we'll catch up with you again soon.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Felicity. Thanks, Suze.